It's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Holger Frydrych, who joined TNG in 2016 and has accumulated vast knowledges on many client projects and also worked on many open source projects. And somehow, in between all that, he found in his free time the resources to produce the Half-Life 2 VR mod, which we'll be hear more about today. And last information, if you're joining us remotely and via Slack, please let us know all your questions in the Kohle Bunker 1 Slack channel so we can ask the speaker afterwards. So without further delay, let us give a warm welcome to our speaker, Holger Frydrych.
All right. Thank you, Christoph. Hello, everyone. My name is Holger. I'm a consultant for TNG by day, and by night, for the past 2 years, I have been the lead developer for the Half-Life 2 VR project. Now, the Half-Life 2 VR project is a fan-made modification for Valve's classic Half-Life 2, which allows you to play the entire game in virtual reality. Oh, sorry. Who here is familiar with Half-Life, the franchise? Yes, okay, that's a solid majority, I'd say. And who has played Half-Life 2 specifically, the original? Yeah, okay, that's still a lot of people. But for those of you who might need a reminder, Half-Life 2 is a first-person shooter game developed by Valve and originally released in 2004. So that's almost 20 years ago now. And as the name might suggest, it's a continuation of the first Half-Life, and it lets the player reprise their role as crowbar-swinging physicist Gordon Freeman, and he's recently woken up from stasis only to find that the world has been conquered by an alien force, the Combine. Quickly, he finds himself in the center of the rebellion's fight against the Combine, and even now, this day, Half-Life 2 remains one of the highest-rated video games of all times, owing in part to its clever use of environmental storytelling, creative level design, innovative use of game physics, at least for the time being, and also just diverse gameplay, because you're not just using guns, you're also riding vehicles, you have to solve physics puzzles, and all that fun. Now, the original game, you traditionally play with a keyboard and a mouse in front of a screen sitting down. With our version, you will instead play it standing up, wearing one of these VR headsets, and using a pair of these VR motion controllers to control the game instead. And I'd like to show you a brief scene how that could look like. No. It's a bit dark, but I hope you can see something at least. Okay, unfortunately, to almost quote Morpheus, no one can be told what virtual reality feels like. You have to experience it for yourself. And no video that I could show you can really convey the feeling what it's like when the game world is not just in front of you in a screen, but suddenly around you, and you can look around, you can see the scale of things, you can see the depth of things, you can notice all these little details in the world that you usually would just ease past. And of course, the VR motion controllers allow you such a more direct and active part in the gameplay than you would normally have it as kind of like a spectator in front of Gordon's shoulders. So that's why we created a demo specifically for you to try it out for yourself. I know some of you already have, but if you haven't, you can find us over there in the Kessel House. Join us later, try it for yourself. But in the meantime, I would like to tell you a little bit about this project, how it came to be, and how we actually went about, oh, sorry. Tricky, okay. How we actually went about turning it into a virtual reality game. So the story of this project, interestingly, already begins as early as 2012. That's over 10 years ago. And that's surprising because it predates the current era of VR hardware. Like, these consumer products didn't exist in 2012. So when programmer Nathan Andrews first began to develop this project, he kind of had to jerry-rig his own VR setup. And he used a Sony head-mounted TV of the time, combined it with some commercial tracking hardware to basically create what we can now buy in a store. Thankfully, 2012 is also the year that a small startup called Oculus launched their Kickstarter campaign for their Oculus Rift VR headset. Now, the consumer version of that headset would still be a few years out, but they did release a couple of developer kits for the Oculus Rift. And so in 2013, the mod was able to be switched to the Oculus DK1. Also around that time, Nathan joined up with an artist, Wormslayer, who assisted him with recreating all the weapon models for VR. I am going to show you later why that was necessary. But even more interestingly, perhaps, Valve themselves were also very much aboard the VR hype train of the time. And Valve actually developed their own native VR mode for Half-Life 2 and some other Source games. Now, this VR mode was much more limited in scope. Specifically, they basically only did the rendering, so you could see the game in the headset, you could look around, but you were still playing with keyboard and mouse, basically. But this VR mode now presented a perfect new foundation to build the mod on, and so Nathan and Wormslayer used the native VR mode and could then focus on adding tracked motion controller support on top of that. Unfortunately, this native VR mode didn't last too long. Valve abandoned it, and due to developments in the Oculus runtime, it also was very quickly no longer compatible and couldn't be run on later Oculus versions, at least not easily. And that left the mod kind of dead in the water at that time. So we jump a little ahead to 2016. 2016 is now the year when the consumer version of the Oculus Rift is released. Oculus is by now part of Facebook, as you might know. And soon after, there's another VR headset released. That's the HTC Vive, which was co-developed by HTC and Valve again. And a couple of new developers contacted Wormslayer. Nathan at the time was no longer interested in the mod. But these new developers suggested they could update the mod and make it compatible with these consumer headsets. And so they set out to work, and a little time later, Wormslayer is also introduced to a contact at Valve in the form of Jan-Peter Ebert, and that eventually leads to a successful Steam Greenlight campaign for Half-Life 2 VR. And that means at that point, the mod has the right to be released on Valve's Steam platform when it's finished. There's a lot of hype and attention on the mod at that point. It goes even so far that the project gets sponsored by the likes of NVIDIA, XMG, HTC, Oculus themselves, who provide hardware for the developers. And so for a while, progress is being made, everything looks good. Unfortunately, after a while, the project basically goes quiet. Might have something to do with the lead developer of the time getting hired by Rockstar, who knows. But in either case, unfortunately, it looks like the mod is dead again. Thankfully, though, some other projects in a similar vein are more successful, and in particular, curiously, the first Half-Life game gets a successful VR conversion mod. And eventually, in 2020, a guy called Elliot Tate founds a Discord server called Flat2VR. So flat basically means like flat screen, and you port it from flat screen to virtual reality. And this Discord is meant as a community for VR enthusiasts, developers, and modders of said conversion mods to together promote knowledge about the mods, promote cooperation among those developers. This Discord now houses over 60 successful Flat2VR conversion projects, including for rather popular newer games like Deep Rock Galactic, Valheim, the Resident Evil franchise, GTFO, and yeah, 60 or more. I'm missing a lot, sorry about that. Anyway, in this community, in July 2021, Elliot Tate introduces WarmSlayer to 2 new developers in an effort to revive the Half-Life 2 VR project. The first one, Dr. Beef, is the creator of the Half-Life 1 VR conversion, and the second one, that's me. So we set out to work. Unfortunately, Dr. Beef could only be with us for a little time, but with the help of Elliot Tate, we slowly grew a new team around the project. And a bit over a year later, in September 2022, we finally released a public beta version right on Steam to overwhelmingly positive reception, thankfully. And a few months later, we also released our VR conversions for the episodic continuations of Half-Life 2, Episode 1 and 2. Okay, with that little history lesson out of the way, let's talk about how do we actually convert a game into virtual reality. For starters, it is tremendously useful if you have source code access to the game. There have been a few mods that manage to do without, but it makes the whole process that much more difficult. Thankfully for us, Valve did release at least parts of the source code of Half-Life 2 in the form of the Source SDK. This SDK contains essentially the entirety of the gameplay code for Half-Life 2, but also a lot of the higher level rendering functionality. And that is perfect for us because the first thing we need to do is to get the game to render in the headset instead of on a screen. Now, you might not be familiar with how games produce frames, so I'll walk over it very quickly on a very higher level. Any game, including Half-Life 2, keeps a representation of its game world in memory. The game world is going to be comprised of a number of entities of different kinds. So an entity could be some part of the static level geometry. It could be a movable prop in the level, like furniture. It could also be an enemy that the player has to face. And there's also will be one entity that represents the player themselves in the game. And on top of that player, either implicitly or explicitly, we will have a sort of virtual camera. This virtual camera, like any entity in the game world, will have a position and an orientation that marks where it's in the world. And the camera additionally also defines this frustum area, which basically defines what the camera can see and what will later end up displayed on your screen. So whenever the game wants to render a frame, it's going to iterate over all of its entities and figure out which of those might be visible to the camera. For those entities, it will then generate draw calls. The draw calls are getting sent to the GPU, and your graphics card then goes through the process of transforming those entities to the camera space, and then it will do a perspective projection to the image plane, and finally it will figure out which pixel values go where, and then send the result to your screen. Now, in a virtual reality headset, we actually need 2 pictures because the left eye and the right eye see 2 slightly different pictures. It's a stereoscopic rendering method, and your brain will then overlap these images and figure out depth and whatnot from that. So what we need to do is we need to change the setup basically to have 2 cameras, one for the left eye, one for the right eye. We also need to ask our VR runtime for the tracking data of the headset. I mean, the headset itself also has a position and orientation in the real world, and we use that position, and then we look at the player entity's position in the game world, and offset that with the position of the headset. And that basically allows us that we can look around with the headset because looking around modifies the orientation of the cameras. And then basically we just go over both cameras, prepare an image for both, send that to the VR runtime, and we are kind of good to go. You can now look around in the world. It will look 3D. It will have depth and scale. That's beautiful. Obviously, I'm skipping over some detail here. and there is math involved, and you're going to get that math wrong. And when you do, funny things happen in the headset, so it's a lot of fun debugging that. But let's move beyond that, because a few problems do still remain. The first one is when you go around the world and you look at stuff, eventually you probably will notice a few details that look weirdly wrong. You'll probably have found a stereo artifact. And what I mean with that is a stereo artifact happens when some detail of the world is rendered differently in one eye than it is in the other. Easiest case would be it's only rendered in one eye and completely missing in the other, or perhaps it's in completely different positions. You never know. I can't show you how that looks like in the headset, obviously, but I can give you an example of such a broken effect. Let's look at this small scene here. You'll notice these electrical arcs, or whatever you call them, that go up and down the teleporter rigs here. And these were specifically one example that just looked wrong in VR. And the reason was that they were slightly differently rendered in each eye. Why was that? Well, it turns out that the game uses randomization when it draws these arcs. So there's a random number generator involved. And obviously, when we've rendered it once for the left eye and then go to the right eye, the RNG is in different state. It produces a slightly different pathway, and so they don't look the same to the two eyes. In this case, the fix is relatively simple. We just have to reset the seed and make sure that it produces the same sequence. There were a couple more artifacts that we found. None of them had to do with RNG, so all of them had slightly different causes, but I think you get the idea. The other issue that you can run in is with our newfound freedom of moving our head around, we can sometimes see things that you originally could not see. The most obvious example that I can give you in Half-Life 2 is the player weapons. If you notice, the player weapons are always positioned in the lower right corner of the screen, which also means that you can never see their right side, in the original game at least. And in fact, when you look at them in a model viewer, you're going to see they do not even have a right side. Which is fair. I mean, why spend the time modeling something out and rendering it when the player can never see it? The problem is, of course, in VR, we absolutely can see. And these gaps are really noticeable and really annoying. Unfortunately, there's not much I can do about that. I'm just a coder. And that's where you need a modeler. And that's also what Wormslayer originally did. He went over all these weapon models, and he remade them in VR, fully modeled out without missing gaps. And we had some more modelers over the time who also worked on the weapons. Right, but that's another problem that you can face in VR, and this is where you need an artist. Maybe in the future you can do it with AI, but today at least, no chance. Okay, now that we basically can look around in VR, let's go to the next step, and that is, how do we control the game in VR? I mean, we could still play it with keyboard and mouse. That's what the original VR mode by Valve did. But we want to use these VR motion controllers and have a little more action. So VR controllers come in different forms and shapes, but luckily, today at least, there's a bit of a standard emerging, and this is this Oculus Touch layout that you can see here. They have two face buttons called AB or XY. You have a clickable thumbstick. You have a trigger at the front of the controller, and you have a bit of a grip button on the side. And while that's not very many controls, especially if you compare it to a traditional gamepad or even a keyboard, we do have the huge advantage that these controllers are also tracked in space. So we have a position and an orientation, and that allows us to come up with creative new ways to interact with the game. But first, before we get to that, let's give our hands a little visual representation in the game. We chose some floating hands that follow the movement of your VR controller. And I don't know if you can see it because it's a bit dark. You also have some control over the state of the hand, like if you're doing a fist or if you're pointing. This is information that the VR runtime actually provides us. It's basing this depending on which kind of controls you're pressing or touching. For example, if I press both the trigger and the side button down, I'll basically have a closed fist in game. If I then release the trigger button, I'm basically pointing ahead. Right? So there's no gameplay reason for this. You can't really do anything with that in the game. It's essentially just to add a bit of immersion, that instead of having some inanimate object that you move around, you have a visual representation of your hand that at least loosely follows what your actual hand is doing. Okay, well, the first thing that we need to talk about is movement in VR. So the first obvious difference to the original flat game is that I can move around physically in VR. I can take a step to the right, can take a step to the left, and this is going to be tracked with the VR headset, whose position will reflect my movement. So far, we only used the VR headset position to modify our camera from where we rendered the game. But what we actually want to do is we want to move the player entity to reflect our real-world movement. We just do that. Basically, we take a delta of the headset position between 2 frames, and then we tell the game, hey, we would like to move the player towards that direction, that amount. And most of the time, the game will say, sure, and move the player. Occasionally, of course, the game might reject the movement because you're trying to move into an obstacle. In that case, we still use the headset's position delta to still modify the camera position, but the player position will not move. Why do we do that? Because we want to allow the player to lean over objects, like this barely visible trash can here. You can physically lean over it, but the player entity cannot move into it. Of course, if you try to move your head into a wall, then we slowly fade the view to black and tell the player, please move back. Now, of course, the game world in Half-Life 2 is way too big. You cannot walk through it just physically. You would need a really, really big space. So you still need some form of artificial movement. In the original game, of course, you do this by WASD or whichever key layout you prefer. So you move your camera with the mouse, and then when you press W, you move towards the camera. We can pretty much use the same method in VR. We'll just use one of the thumbsticks that is hidden here. So when I press the thumbstick forward, it's going to be the same as W in the game, and it will move the player forward. Except one little detail. Which direction is forward? Because in the original game, there's just the camera direction, right? I always move towards the camera. But in VR, I have at least 2 possibilities. The first one is what the VR headset is looking at, so what the player is looking at. The other possibility is what the controller is pointing towards. So if I'm looking over there and my controller is pointing over there, what should happen if I press the thumbstick forward? It turns out that the VR community at large is split on this question. So the best thing you can do, and the thing that we did, is make it configurable. By default, when you move forward, you move in the direction that you're looking at. But if you prefer, you can change it and instead move in the direction that your controller is pointing. Unfortunately, motion sickness is an issue in VR, and not everyone can stomach this kind of artificial motion. It's basically kind of similar to seasickness, just the reverse. You can see a movement, but you cannot feel it in your inner ears. And that can cause sickness or at least discomfort in people, especially if you're new to VR. Many people can get used to it over time, especially if they take it slowly, do shorter regular sessions. Unfortunately, not everyone can. And that's why VR games came up with a different method of movement. It's aptly called teleportation. It's really just that. It works kind of like this. You use your controller to point somewhere in the world, and then you basically get teleported instantly to that location in just a blink. So there is no artificial movement, and you kind of forgo this problem, hopefully at least. Now, we did not originally feature teleportation on our first public beta release, simply because implementing teleportation movement in a game that was not designed for it is not trivial. You have to figure out a system that can allow the player to reach all the places that they usually could reach without allowing them to get into areas of the game that you are not supposed to reach. And that's a bit tricky. The other problem is in Half-Life 2, as in many other games, there are often invisible gameplay elements, particular so-called trigger volumes. And when the player walks through them and touches them, they trigger some kind of events in the game world. Now with teleportation, it's super easy to just breeze through such a trigger without ever touching it. And that could completely break the game and prevent you from progressing. So we also had to figure out which triggers you might potentially have teleported through and activate them manually in that case. Okay, another fun thing, every once in a while in Half-Life 2 you're going to encounter a ladder. And if you played the original game, you might have mixed memories of ladders. They are a bit notorious in Half-Life 2 for being kind of easy to fall down. We took the opportunity in VR to make it a little bit more engaging. Again, sorry, the sun is really not in my favor today, but I'll try to explain it anyway. So, ladder climbing in VR, the way we did it, we tried to very loosely emulate how you would climb a real ladder as far as we can. And basically, you approach the ladder, reach one hand out, press the grip button to attach to the ladder, and then basically you pull yourself up, and then you repeat with the other hand ad nauseum. Probably looks a bit silly when I do it like this, but I think it's a bit more fun in VR than just breezing it up and down. When you reach the top, since we can't really do a proper ladder dismount, we're going to show you a ladder dismount point like this, and when you let go of the ladder, you're going to get teleported there instantly. Okay, besides movement, obviously we also need to be able to interact with the world. There are two types of interactions in Half-Life 2's world. One, you can pick up stuff. Half-Life 2, having a rather dedicated physics engine at the time, has a lot of objects that are movable that you can pick up, throw around to amuse yourself, and sometimes also to solve physics puzzles in the game. So grabbing stuff works like this. You point at the object you want to pick up, and you use the grip button, kind of like making a fist to grab something. And we allow grabbing over a certain distance, so you can remote pick up something. It will just float to your hand. It's obviously not realistic, but the reason we do this is convenience. If we didn't do this, you would regularly have to crouch down, and that gets old really fast. And after all, it should be a fun experience and not a chore. So this is how it looks in the game. Obviously, you have two hands, so you can pick up two items at once if you like. The other kind of interactions are when you have to activate something like a button or switch in the world. In that case, again, you point your hand towards it, and this time you press the trigger in the front to activate something. One particular interaction we have is the flashlight. So in VR, our flashlight follows the head movement. It's kind of like a headlamp, and so how do you activate it? Well, you turn your controller towards your head and press the trigger button again, like a switch. Okay, let's get to the fun part. Half-Life 2 being a shooter, obviously weapons are one of the core mechanics of the game. And in the game, you will find a total of 11 different weapons that you can use as the player. Now, each of them has slightly different characteristics, and we try to make them as unique and engaging to use in VR, because after all, the reason is we want to be in the action and we want to give players something to do. The first step we need to figure out is how do you switch between weapons in VR. In the original game, you can scroll through your weapons with the mouse wheel or can use the number buttons to cycle through your weapons, but that's a lot of inputs that we don't have, so we need something more gesture-based. And the system that we came up with is you basically press the thumbstick of your weapon hand down, and when you do, this hexagonal menu is going to appear in front of your hand, and then you move your hand towards the tile of the weapon that you want to select, and then just let go and the weapon will be in your hand. I'll try to show it in motion. Right, so open the menu, move somewhere, and the weapon will be in your hand. So the reason I like the system and why we chose it is because I think it's a really fluent and quick way to change weapons, and it actually goes very well with muscle memory. So with a bit of practice, and not initially, but with a bit of practice, you can basically learn to do it blind and quickly. So I know if I want to select the crowbar, I just go this, and I know I have it. I don't even need to look. And that's, of course, a big advantage if you are in an intense firefight, your favorite gun runs out of ammo, and you need to switch to something else. But now, let's get to the core mechanic. Obviously, we need to be able to aim and fire guns. This is really straightforward. The gun is attached to your controller, so you use the controller to point and then use the trigger to shoot. One thing you might notice in this clip is there is no such thing as a crosshair or anything that indicates where you're aiming at. And in fact, by default, you have to aim by the weapon sights manually. If you do not like that, or if that's too difficult for you, we do have optional laser pointers. Those of you who played our demo already saw them. You can enable them in the menu, and then you will basically see. So there will be a little red line coming out of the weapon that will show you where you're aiming. Next, one of the aspects where we went really differently to the base game is how to reload weapons. In the original game, or really any flat shooter, reloading a weapon is basically you press a button, an animation plays, and your gun is reloaded. And you can do that in VR. It's a bit boring and a bit weird to see your hand just magically animate a reload animation. And we wanted to give the players a little more to do than just point and shoot. So we divided the action of reloading into several different steps that you have to do manually. For the pistol specifically, there are 3 steps. The first is you have to eject the empty magazine. Then you reach over your shoulder, you grab a new magazine, you insert it into the gun, and finally you'll have to pull the slide back to chamber a new round. So dropping the empty magazine is located on one of the face buttons, the lower one, the A button. It will just drop the magazine. And then with your other hand, you reach over your shoulder. The shoulder area we basically determine by the head position with a little offset. We have a fairly generous area that you can grab at. You use the grip button because you're grabbing something. You get a new magazine, and then you move it towards the gun. And when it's close enough to the bottom of the gun, the game will play a short animation where the magazine is inserted, and you're done with that. Now, if you need to pull the slide back, basically you again grab at the top of the weapon, and once you're grabbed, we track the relative position of the 2 controllers to each other. If we detect that you have moved it slightly back, then we play the animation that pulls back the slide and chamber the new round. Other weapons feature slightly differently. I don't have time to show you all of them, but I'll show you the shotgun now. The major difference with the shotgun is that it's a 2-handed weapon. You basically need to use both hands because you need to pump the shotgun after each shot. And then you also reload shells individually, or actually two shots per one shell, because it's a balancing reason we figured out that doing it one shot, one clip, it takes too long. Anyway, pumping the shotgun again is fairly similar to the slide. So when you grab onto the front part of the weapon, we again track the relative positioning of the controllers, and when they are close enough to each other, we pull back the slide via animation. Then, of course, we have the famous crowbar. What would Half-Life 2 be without the crowbar? Now, the crowbar is a bit of an odd one out because it's a melee weapon, not a gun. And one thing that VR cannot do is it cannot simulate resistance for you. So, of course, in the flat game, you just press the attack button and the swing animation will play. But in VR, obviously, we want you to swing the crowbar yourself. But you're not going to feel any resistance. You're hitting the open air. Unless you venture too close to a wall in real life and hit the wall. I do not recommend that. It might be more immersive, but it really hurts, so don't do that. But really, it's not as much of a problem as you might think, because we do still have some feedback. We have a visual cue. You will see when the crowbar hits something. You'll also hear an audio cue. There's going to be a sound effect. And of course, we send a small haptic vibration to the controller, so it will rumble a little bit when you hit something. And with that combined, I personally think whacking at stuff like these planks or some manhacks is really fun. And I think that's the main part. I mean, we're not trying to do a real-life simulation. We are just trying to do something fun. And speaking of fun, something else that's kind of cool in VR is throwing stuff. In this part, grenades. How do you throw grenades in Half-Life 2 VR? First step, put on your safety straps. Don't be the guy who throws this controller through the room. That's not cool. Don't skip that step. Then you use the trigger button, hold it down to prime the grenade, and then you kind of do a real-life throwing motion, and at the end of it, release the trigger, and the grenade is going to go flying. And it looks like this, if you can see it, hopefully. And yeah. So as fun as throwing grenades is, implementing a throw in VR is not. The reason is that throwing stuff in real life is a fairly intricate movement, and there's a lot of small details that we understand intuitively, and so we have certain expectations of how our throw should go. And in VR, we only have a bit of limited information. I mean, we have the position of the controller and its relative velocity at the end of that movement. And from that, you kind of have to infer something that feels good enough to the player to not be weird. And that involves a lot of trial and error, and it's difficult to get it perfect. I don't think we got it perfect, and it works better on some controllers than on others. But I do think it's pretty fun when it works, and if in doubt, you can also roll the grenade instead of throwing it. That works too, sometimes even better. However, Half-Life 2 has a few scenes where it requires you to throw grenades really precisely. Like in this instance where you're supposed to hit this small window behind which a sniper is waiting that you need to take out. And in a flat game with mouse and keyboard, this is easy to do, but with the manual throwing in VR, you can't make that throw. I mean, or you can probably if you try hard enough, but it's really annoying, really frustrating. And so we came up with a fallback method to throwing grenades, which works like this. You basically press the secondary face button, the one on the front, if you can see it. You hold it down, and then this yellow arc will appear. And this yellow arc you can aim by pointing your controller to where you want the grenade to go. And when you release the button, the grenade will follow the trajectory of that arc. And that allows us to do precise throws when we need them. I still think manually throwing is more fun, but for those instances where you need it, that's what you need to do. And that actually is also pretty much what I wanted to tell you today. There are some more details and stories I could tell you. I just don't have the time. But I wanted to take a few minutes at least to introduce you to the team behind this effort. Currently, we have Wormslayer, who I've already mentioned before. He's the torchbearer who was with the project almost from the beginning, over 10 years now. He's our lead artist, and joining him on the artist side are Shotgunner Fox, our resident animator, Mavis, Alexios, Kretilesh, and our audio engineer, Fred Fingers. And on the programming side, beside myself, we have August Coder, Higher Flyer, Marky Parky. Thank you, guys. Also, thank all the people who were part of the project in the past or contributed to it. You can see the list on the right. Thank you, guys. Without you, this project would not exist, would never have been finished. And finally, also a shout out to the other people who helped us along the way, who assisted us. Of course, big thanks to Valve for creating Half-Life 2 in the first place, for allowing us to do this mod, for allowing us to release it on Steam. Inimitable, he's one of our longtime beta testers, and he also helped us today to prepare the demo that you played or hopefully will play. And of course, Elliot Tate, who I already mentioned, who brought us together with his networking skills, and who also did a lot of marketing for us. You might wonder, why do you need marketing for a free mod? But hey, if no one knows about your mod, what good is your work, right? So thank you, Elliot. And speaking of marketing, you can't really do a game release without a cool trailer. And the funny thing about VR trailers is you actually have the opportunity to really act out scenes in VR. And the actor for our trailers was Echo Smoker, and together with our team member Mavis, they produced 3 wonderful trailers for our Half-Life 2 and the episode releases. And I want to finish this talk by showing you the final one that they did for the episode 2, because I think it turned out wonderfully, and I just can't think of a better way to summarize this talk than show you this trailer. I hope you enjoy it. Here we go. If you can see it. It should be a bit lighter soon.
What you're seeing is the infancy of a super portal. If it attains full strength,
it'll be the 7-hour war all over again. Except this time we won't last 7 minutes.
All right.
Thank you very much for the really fun talk. I guess we will all rush over to the 3 headsets we have on site. But before that, maybe we have some questions here in the audience. Oh, many. Okay, but we have time. It's fine.
First of all, thank you for talking about the project. During the whole talk, I was wondering, because Half-Life 2 has quite the infamous vehicle section at the beginning, and you were showing some in the trailer, how you dealt with that, also in regards to motion sickness.
A very good question, yes. Unfortunately, I didn't have time really in the talk. But to answer you quickly, we came up with a couple of different camera modes for the vehicles. So the original mode where you're basically sitting in the cockpit, you're right, this is very, very much motion sickness inducing, and it does require a good iron stomach to stomach that. When we released, we had in the beginning, in the first beta, we had a separate camera mode that was kind of like a third-person mode where the camera was slightly behind the vehicle, and that this decouples you a bit from the all-too-frantic movement and makes it a little bit better. And later down the line, we added several more modes. And one of them is sort of like a teleporting camera mode. We can't really do teleport movement for the vehicle, but we could do it for the camera. So how it works is, it's again a third-person perspective, and you drive a little bit, and when the vehicle is a certain distance from the camera, it teleports again behind the camera, but otherwise remains static. And if even that doesn't work, the final mode that we implemented is sort of a cinema mode, in which case the game essentially switches back to flat screen gaming. And we just present you a big 2D screen in front of you, and you can see the vehicles on that screen in 2D until you get out of the vehicle, then you switch back to VR. And I hope that will allow as many people as possible to play them. I don't really know what more we can do.
So I'm curious about what's happening behind the scenes when you're modding a game. Like, how does it look? Do you just get the source code from Valve and change whatever you want, or what are the things you can change or not change when you're modding the game, and how?
Mm-hmm. So our project was based on the Source SDK, as I said, and the Source SDK is a freely available modding SDK for source-based games. So Source Engine is the engine behind Half-Life 2. And it contains a good portion of the game code, specifically the gameplay code. And that's what we can use to basically implement our VR interactions, replace keyboard and mouse input. And it does also contain some of the rendering code, not all of it. Specifically, some of the lower level details are missing. And we do actually need them because when we submit our images to the VR pipeline, the VR runtime, we need these lower level details. And so there are some hooks in place where we grab information that is not directly available to us. Yeah.
Hey, thanks for the talk. I want to ask if you had to change the difficulty in any way at some ports. So there are some things you can do, like you can cower behind cover and shoot with your gun above the cover and never get hit, which you cannot do in the base game. But you also have, these onslaught fights, which especially on a harder difficulty are quite difficult in the base game. And I would say in VR are almost impossible unless you're an experienced VR player. So did you have to do anything about that?
We did not change anything about the difficulty. But you are right, there are some elements that are easier to do in VR, and there are some elements that are harder, specifically because you have to do all this manual reloading, so you're much more active, you're much more frantic, some things can go wrong. I would say on average the game is a little bit harder in VR, but not tremendously so for most parts. Personally, I've played through it in the normal difficulty without too much problems. I know some people played on hard and finished it. It is possible. In general, I think it works okay.
Okay, maybe before we go further in the audience, in Slack we have some questions. One big question is if your mod is multiplayer capable, or if there's anything on the flat 2 VR mod space where it is multiplayer capable.
No, our mod is not multiplayer capable. Fairly early on we decided we want to focus on the single player campaign just to get it finished, because adding multiplayer support obviously is a whole other beast, and our time is not infinite, especially if you do this in your free time after our works. So that was one of the decisions that we said we are not going to do. There are mods for games that are multiplayer. For example, because I personally like to play it, Deep Rock Galactic has a mod that works in multiplayer. And GTFO has a mod that works in multiplayer. I have never played it personally, but I know it works. So there are some, yes.
With maybe time for a few more questions, I don't know, maybe.
Thanks for the great presentation. I had exactly this question, like, what do you think, how many hours did you spend to create this project, like, on your side?
Oh, man. So I've been part of the project for about 2 years, and especially in the beginning, I do think I invested a lot of time into it. Many weekends, many after hours. Probably wasn't healthy, but it was also the beginning, it was still middle in the pandemic, so what else can you do? So, yeah, but I am also kind of glad that I'm mostly done now, and yeah, it does take time, definitely.
Thanks a lot for the nice presentation. A few decades ago, I was coding a 2D platform game just for sake of fun. Yeah? So it was assembler for the Amiga computer. And something which was completely unexpected for me was how complex it is to code the interaction with the joystick and the main player. Mm-hmm. There, it's just crazy complex. Is it like something expected on your side about this complexity when you started, invest in those 3 years of your free time?
To some extent, probably. There was also things probably that I didn't expect. The source engine is also a very particular kind of beast, and it was not very cooperative in the beginning. So it took quite a while to get familiar with it and to really understand how to do things. Specifically now, joystick movement, the advantage that we had is that Valve already built the movement code. So we didn't really have to do that from the ground up. We basically just had to say, okay, we have now the input from our motion controller instead of the gamepad, but we can send it to the same part and the game will just work as it did before. We did modify the movement a little bit. We took out some of the inertia and bobbing that games tend to do in Flat, specifically because they tend to not be comfortable in VR. But aside from that, thankfully, we did not have to touch the movement code too much in that regard.
Cool mod, great talk. My question is, since the reload reminded me of Alex immediately, did you pay special mind to the weight of ragdolls and physics objects? Because that game does, and I don't know if this mod does too.
So first of all, you're right. We did draw inspiration heavily from Half-Life Alyx because why not? It seems like the best idea to do. Valve is mastermind at really figuring out the details of stuff and getting it really smooth. Even our weapon selection was loosely inspired by Half-Life Alyx. As for the weight of objects, no, we don't really take that into account. Most of the objects you basically just grab and they are weightless in your hand and they just move around like that. There are a few exceptions where they get above a certain weight, like the ragdolls do, and then it becomes more of a dragging motion, so then you can't pick them up anymore, but you can kind of drag them around, but that's really the only difference we're doing.
Okay, then maybe the last question from Slack before everybody goes to dinner and tries it out. How many really game hours did you spend in your own mod playing?
I think my Steam counter is 300 hours, possibly 250 at least, something like that, yeah.
Okay, then again, thank you, Holger, for this really interesting talk, and